Hello, it's Emily Wishall, the host of Radical Embodiment, the podcast, and I'm so excited today to bring you episode 3 of season 2. Today I am interviewing Suzanne Hanna. I have known Suzanne for several years now. Suzanne is an incredible woman, human, teacher. I have just been personally just touched by her depth of heart and her willingness to just support others and bring community together. Suzanne is a therapist. She's been in the industry for over 25 years. She's a coach. She's a writer. She is a shadow worker. If you don't know what shadow work is, we go into the depths of shadow work in the episode. That really is a big, strong part of Suzanne's expertise. And she's an advocate for internal freedom. Suzanne has just such a plethora of rich wisdom and teaching and guidance to offer. So I hope you enjoy the episode. I'm sure that you will have some insights and aha moments. And now we'll go to the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm here with Suzanne Hanna. Suzanne, I'm so happy, excited to honored to have you on, really excited to get to dive deeper into this conversation. We've just been chatting a little bit. You're such a wealth of wisdom. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I've been wanting to do this for a while now.
So I like to start these conversations just with the kind of a simple but yet complex question of just asking every guest I have on the podcast of what does embodiment mean to you?
To me, it's everything. So I will tell you why I say that, because I think most of us, the majority of us, walk through this world living in our heads and actually very disconnected from our bodies, because in our bodies is where our experiences live. It's where our trauma lives. It's where our wounds live. It's where, our joy lives. It's where everything lives. And I believe that from a very young age, between all of the wounding that we all experience, but also the intensity of it, it causes us to not want to be in our bodies. And so therefore we find ways to get out of our bodies. And one of the ways that we do that is just by living in our head and overanalyzing and overthinking. So to me, embodiment is actually living in the body. But one of the ways that we do that I think is so potent is by living through our senses. And I think that we are so numb to our senses, whether it is smell, touch, taste, feel, all of those things. We're so numb to those at this point that I think that, for instance, you can't smell something and not be in your body. You can't feel something and not be in your body. So I think, the senses are the portal to the body.
Love that.
And yeah. And so I think that one of the things that is so crucial and such a big part of aliveness is to constantly ask ourselves, what do I feel? What do I see? What do I sense? What do I smell? What can I touch? All of that as a gateway to remaining in our body.
So thank you. Yeah, like so simply put, right? Yes, it's accessible. I think what I'm finding often, especially with the word embodiment, it can have such a strong hold, or maybe there's some judgment coming around, like superiority of I'm more embodied than you. Or I've had clients where they've shared practitioners they've worked with in the past who've just been like, just drop into your body, just drop. And they're like, well, I don't like how. And so I love that as just connecting more with your senses, having more of bringing more of your awareness to the forefront of your senses as a gateway, as a portal to being in your body. Because I think anybody, wherever they're at in their experience with their body, can access that.
Yeah. And if you think of it this way, it's also a pathway to presence. And I believe that we can't be in our bodies without being present. So if you think about, if I ask somebody sometimes, what do you see? What do you sense? What do you feel? What do you taste? They immediately have to be present in order to answer those questions. So it is so crucial, I think, and so important that without presence, it's very, very hard to stay in your body.
Yeah.
And with presence, we are allowed to kind of, if we're not in our bodies, we're kind of, it's a gateway into the body. And I think that just by nature being human, we go in and out of our body all the time. I think that's just part of the human journey because staying in our body 100% of the time can feel very intense.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that by nature, but the key to me is that that's where our aliveness is.
Mhm.
So the more we can be in our body, the more alive we can feel. And to me, there's nothing better than feeling alive,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I just appreciate you named it's normal to not be in our body all the time. And it makes sense. I think it's a really smart strategy for our nervous system. And
Mhm.
um, what would you say for your in your own personal experience and journey of embodiment and learning to be in your body more and learning to be in that aliveness more? If you have a sense that you could share with us in your own personal journey of how has that like impacted your relationship with your body, how has it supported your experience, yeah, with your body?
Oh my God, I could talk about 2 hours on this topic, so I'm going to make it really quick. I think the first time I truly landed in my body was when I took my journey across the United States with my dog.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the reason being is because I had spent a lifetime running from everything that frightened me, anything that made me uncomfortable. So I think I spent a good portion of the first part of my life out of my body. And then as I began to come face to face with those things, when I made a conscious choice to do that, I landed in my body. And when I first landed in my body, it was really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Really, really uncomfortable. And through that process and through experiencing what was happening in my body, I was able to metabolize it a little at a time until I got to the point where being in my body actually wasn't scary at all. It was actually alivening, and it was
Mhm.
a huge awakening to wow. It's almost like I say to people, if you ever watch The Wizard of Oz and it goes from black and white to Technicolor,
Mhm.
that's what I think it feels like. And that transition can be really uncomfortable. But once you're there and
Yeah.
once you spend more time there, it actually is, the first question you'll ask yourself is, oh my God, where have I been all these years?
Like totally.
Where have I been?
Right. It's like you don't even know until then you're there and you're like, oh wow. And for me, like once I totally, I think, agree. And with most of my clients, the more they come into their body, there is some deep discomfort that comes up with it. Could be some suppressed emotions, memories. And I love how you shared of like you metabolize that little by little. And I might have you speak on that here in a minute. But I think it is common that discomfort to come up, but then it's just like coming home of, oh, right, like there's this vast universe within me, this vast experience, this rich experience to have that is alive, that is like titillating,
Mhm.
that is this can become your sanctuary. So when you shared that you kind of metabolized little by little, I think you're speaking to like the discomfort that came up. Can you speak to that? Like, what do you mean by
Yeah.
that?
So, from a physiological level, we are hardwired to suppress things that we believe that we cannot handle, whether that's certain types of traumas, whether it's certain types of pain, whether it's a certain level of discomfort. We are actually physically hardwired to, when it gets too overwhelming, to
Mm,
shut down. That's what we're hardwired to do. I mean, I've worked with, trauma for 25 years, and the way trauma works is that when the brain feels that this is too much and we cannot handle it, it will actually do it for us by suppressing what we feel we cannot handle.
mm,
And if we try to excavate that too fast and too quickly, we actually can re-traumatize ourselves. So what I always say to people, the key is to metabolize a little at a time, a little at a time. And when we do that, then we can kind of step into this in a way that's not either re-traumatizing or so frightening that we won't want to do it.
Yeah.
I think being on a healing journey is so key because this is not something we can do alone. It is just not something we can do alone. And we need guides. We need people to help us go into that process little by little by little and
Mm-hmm.
hold sacred space and actually create what I call reparative experiences
Mm.
so that then we can say, okay, I can stay in my body a little bit longer. I can stay here a little bit longer because anything that's going to feel too intense or intolerable, we're going to jump out. It's just the way we're hardwired.
Yeah. Yeah. You're using the language like metabolizing. I think of it as like titration and like
Yeah.
titrating little by little, just like you might, I don't know, titrate maybe a chemical solution. I don't, I don't know. I used to really
Right.
love chemistry. And we can't do it alone. We're not supposed to do it alone. We need to be held in that. And
Mhm.
so with that, I feel like you're an expert and a big part of your world is shadow work.
Mhm.
And so I'd love for you, because shadow work, listeners might be familiar with it. They might have heard of blips of it, or they might have like, what the
Mhm.
heck? Like, am I supposed to go stand in the sun and look at my shadow? So I'd love for you to just, what is shadow work? And then we'll dive into that because it's so related to it's all of this in this embodiment work. And I think it helps speak to the fact and the truth of we're not supposed to be in this embodiment, this healing journey alone. Like shadow work, especially, you cannot do that by yourself.
Yeah, so the easy way to explain shadow is that it's all the things that we've experienced in our lifetime that we have felt was either intolerable, too uncomfortable, too fearful, so we repress it into the unconscious.
Mhm.
So that could be something as simple as, my parents got divorced and, I perceived that it was my fault. And so there's a piece of that that I begin to suppress. But what most people don't understand, it's not just the painful things that we suppress. We also suppress our gifts, our talents, our joys, because we're very often told things like, don't you think you're too big for your britches?
Yeah.
Or you can't do that? Or, who do you think you are? All the things around imposter syndrome. So, what we do is we hide anything or suppress anything that's going to make someone else uncomfortable. So, in doing that, what happens is we kind of walk through life trying to um, only showing, we create what we call a false persona. So we create this false persona around, you'll like me if I'm like this, you'll accept me if I'm like this. And then what ends up happening is the shadow is actually designed to protect us.
Mm.
And so it's trying to protect us from rejection. It's trying to protect us from failure. It's trying to protect us from being judged. But in doing so, it suppresses our life force. And so in essence, we go around being hyper vigilant, like, I can't do that because what if they judge me? Or I can't take that risk because if I take that risk, what if I fail? And so we live life in a very shallow way. And what ends up happening is that most people I talk to, they say, you know, um, I just feel numb, or I just feel
Mm.
disconnected, or I just feel like that's not possible for me, or I just feel like I can't do that. And it's all of the what ifs. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? And so the shadow just basically says, stay small and hidden so that you won't experience more pain. But
Mm.
in staying small and hidden, we create an environment of pain. And so doing shadow work is sort of the excavation process of taking what's unconscious and making it conscious so that then we can choose how we want to be in relationship with that. And instead of, instead of the shadow having us, we work with the shadow. Because as long as
Mm-hmm.
you're human, you're always going to have a shadow. It's just
Mm-hmm.
we're comprised of dark and light. That's just who we
Mm-hmm.
are. However, it's not just the dark, it's the light we also suppress and minimize.
Yeah.
And so it's both and. And so in shadow work, we refer to as the dark shadow and the golden shadow. And the golden shadow is our light, and the dark shadow is the dark part. So
I like that you used golden. I always think of it just as light and dark shadow, but golden feels so much like warmer.
yeah, it's Carl Jung is the founder of shadow work, and he called it the golden shadow and the dark shadow. Um, and so I love that because it gives us an idea that there are pieces of our life that we're equally afraid of our power
Yeah.
as we are our fear. We're equal, in fact, in some ways more so. And so it's not just these pieces of us that we judge, it's also the pieces of us that are going to allow us to be seen,
Yeah.
allow us to be visible. So that's why I think this work is so important, because we have to know, we have to make what's unconscious conscious in order to heal fully,
Yeah.
because otherwise, whatever's unconscious is going to keep running the show because it's how we
Mhm.
live by default. And
Totally.
so when I work with people, I often see, what are some patterns that keep showing up? What are some of the generational traumas that keep showing up? What are some of the what are some of the ways we continuously sabotage ourselves? And I keep having people do that over and over again. And then it's almost like this awareness of like meeting yourself for the first time, because so much of this we're not even aware of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are there like, I don't know, one or two or three golden or dark shadows that you see as kind of common?
Part of our golden shadow, I think the biggest pieces are our personal power. That's a big, big piece. We're terrified of our power.
Yeah.
Another piece is visibility and really being seen. That's a big piece of the golden shadow. Another piece of the golden shadow is really stepping fully into our gifts in a way that we are embodying them. There's the word embody. Um, that we're embodying them for a higher purpose and doing that consistently.
Mm-hmm.
For the dark shadow, the primary pieces I would say are really around fear and shame and self-doubt, and all of the small pieces and big pieces of trauma that have been so embedded into our cellular memory that we begin to actually, I have a term in shadow work called the storyteller. We actually create a storyteller that begins to tell us the story of our shadow. And so when I hear people say things like, oh, I could never do that, that's a story of your shadow, because the truth of the matter is that that's not even based in any form of truth.
Yeah.
It's just a story that gets created in order to fuel the dark shadow so that we actually stay small.
Mm.
And once we get to really understand that about 90% of our stories are actually birthed from our shadow, it is a
That's a
huge
big
awakening,
percentage.
because it's a huge percentage, but it is about 90%.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the number one thing I say to people all the time, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the work of Byron Katie, but one
Mm-hmm.
of the number one things that she says is it true?
I was thinking that when you were
And
just speaking. Yeah.
most of the things that we say are not true. They are
Mm-hmm.
stories that are created in
Mm-hmm.
order to some way protect us from having to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
right?
And when we're just living life, and we're busy or full of schedules, or you got, kids to care for, work to do, what all the demands of, daily life, and you're not in your body, you're not present to present moment, you're not present to what is. I I mean, those stories have so much grip and hold and control over the way that you are existing, over the decisions that you're making in your day. And you're really not in like what I think of as like your full sovereignty. You're really not operating from a place that is true and that has your greatest overall well-being and good. Yeah. Yeah, because they have the hold.
Yeah, because again, it's when we buy into the shadow stories, then what ends up happening is it becomes so much a part of our identity that we actually buy into that as our truth. One of the things that I say to people is that the beauty of the shadow is that it is the gateway to what is really true, our deeper truth. Because all of this other stuff is really just smoke and mirrors to what is really true. And when people start to get the concept that so much of our suffering is self induced, there is a sense of liberation that happens, and people get to say, wow, I actually have a choice, you know?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think that's also, having that realization of, oh, a lot of the suffering is self-induced is to me a key indicator of too why it's important to be on this journey with support with a guide. Because yes, you can have that experience of feeling really liberated and having choice. And if you're kind of alone in that realization, it could quickly, I think, go into shame or making yourself feel wrong or overwhelmed in that, which, yeah. So I'd love for you to speak to if you see, I'm going to say like a couple questions and then you can
Okay,
talk to this.
go for it.
Because I think that they're all kind of go in line. So one, I'm curious, as you're speaking about like where would you say, you're talking about the shadows and the unconscious. If there's a place that exists, like where would that be? And yeah, let me just have you answer that question and then I'll.
Okay, so if we're going to look at this from a physiological level, so every single cell in our body has a memory,
Mhm.
and our shadow lives in cellular memory. So, one of the ways that the shadow functions is through triggers. So, for instance, let's say you've had a history of sexual abuse
Mhm.
and you're in a situation where somebody comes up from behind you and just touches you gently. You might have a physiological trigger to that, even though you're not in danger, you're safe, there's nothing bad happening, but there's a cellular memory that gets activated, that gets triggered, and that brings up a certain physiological response in the body, and that attached to that is a shadow story. I'm in danger, something bad is going to happen, blah blah, all of those things. And we have to learn the difference between shadow fear and
Mhm.
intuitive fear, because they're very different
Mhm.
things.
Mhm.
Everything in the body has a shadow side and a light side. So fear has a shadow side and a light side. Anger has a shadow side and a light side. When we get to know the difference between those two, then we're really able to say, oh, okay, I'm acting and responding from the shadow side of my fear in this moment. So the shadow lives in every single cell of our body. It's in our cellular memory. And what we're doing is that's why when I say we're making what's unconscious conscious, because the majority of our cellular memory, we're not even consciously aware of. Every single experience you've ever had in your life is stored in a cellular memory. Everything, both good and bad.
Yeah.
Everything is stored in a memory.
Wow. Would you say to be like distinguishing between, for example, fear, intuitive fear versus the shadow fear? And I'm imagining, an individual has to do work to kind of have their own felt sense of that. But is there any sort of general sense that comes about, or maybe in your experience that you feel that helps kind of distinguish the difference?
Yeah, it's really based. So shadow fear always has a story.
Got it.
right? And light side of emotions doesn't have a story. So for instance, if you're feeling, this is why embodiment is so important. If you're sensing and feeling that something doesn't feel right,
Mhm.
there's no story to that. It's just a sensation. It's an inner knowing.
Mm.
Something isn't right. But when it's a shadow fear, there's a lot of story attached to it. And that's the difference between the two. It's like the difference between your emotion being an ally and sort of a GPS system, and your emotion inundating you and flooding you with intense disembodied emotion.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Do you believe the more, since I'm going to ask this question and the context too is, radical embodiment, this podcast right now, my platform with my book, my overarching intention is to really support women in shifting the narrative that our worth is built around our weight, which I believe the more we can choose to be radically embodied, choose to come into our body, the more we can come into our full sovereignty and not get so swayed into marketing, into advertising, into all that comes with that.
Mhm.
um so do you believe the more we integrate our shadows, that starts to shift our relationship with our body or our relationship with food, meaning in a way that is more empowered, that's coming from a place of empowered choice?
Mhm.
And if so, how do you see that happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely because here's the thing. The more we're integrated in our body, period, but certainly our shadow and our golden shadow, our spirit, all of these pieces of ourselves, the more we're integrated, then the more we're coming from a very empowered place where we actually get to choose as opposed to living by default or living unconsciously. Most people who have a challenging relationship with food, it's not because they're consciously choosing to do that, but they're unconsciously choosing by default what is, and most people, in my experience, and you could probably speak to this, most people turn to food as a form of comfort.
Mhm.
And what ends up happening when we're in a place of disembodiment, there's always going to feel like this sense of discomfort. I don't want to feel, I don't want to know, I don't want to. And again, this is happening unconsciously most of the time, not because we're bad people,
Yeah.
not because we're limited, not because we are self destructive, but really because we're responding to some type of internal stimuli that is so uncomfortable that we want to have an immediate, we want to numb. We want to numb. We want to numb. So, whether it's the trap of food, or the trap of busyness, or the trap of self sabotage, or the trap of excuses, or the
Mhm.
trap of all of these are different types of traps, they all do the same thing, which is take us out of our body so that we don't have to feel what is in our body.
Yeah.
It's a form of, it's a channel to disconnect. That's
Hmm.
what it is. And so we look for something externally so that we don't have to feel internally. And one of the things that I think is really important in this journey is like what we talked about at the very beginning. How do we do this little by little by little
Yeah.
so that we're not seeking these things in order to numb ourselves, that we actually can get to a place where we actually want to live in our bodies? And what I have found too is that the more conscious we are, the more we create different relationships with things, different relationships with our body, different relationships with food, different relationships with other people. All of that gets shifted because we're coming from a deeper sense of awareness. And therefore, we are able to see, oh, I see what I've been doing. I've been doing this because of this. Now I can make a different choice and do it this way. And that's going to impact everything. It's like a ripple effect. So
Hmm.
I always say to people, food is not the problem.
Yeah.
You know, you know, uh, it's just, if you think about it, and even things like, working with people who may have been accustomed to, let's say, gain more weight, all of that is happening purposely and intentionally because there's something in the body, whether it's a form of protection, whether it's a form of disconnection, whatever it is, nothing happens randomly.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing
Mm-hmm.
happens randomly. And
Mm-hmm.
so we have to really look at these things and say, that's why I say to people, just going on a diet to release weight is not necessarily going to be the answer because there's so much more underneath there because you're going to go back into default patterns quickly because we're hardwired to gravitate towards what's familiar. We're just
Mm-hmm.
hardwired that way. And not
Mm-hmm.
because we're bad, or there's something wrong with us. We're all that way, and we all have different traps. For me personally, one of my traps is busyness. And so when I want to disconnect, I just get really busy, right? And so when
Yeah.
I'm really busy, I have to pause for a second and say, okay, what am I looking to disconnect from? What's going on? What inside of me is feeling intolerable in this moment that I am looking to distract myself from it. So it isn't as simple as just choosing to not eat certain foods or choosing to release weight or
Yeah.
choosing, I feel like there needs to your insides need to align with your outsides. There needs to be, that has to happen in order for us to make sustainable change.
Totally, totally agree with that. A few things that I just want to reiterate. One, like that question you just named is so valuable. When we notice we're really busy, or when the more aware you become of maybe some of your own tendencies and patterns, as they creep up, maybe taking a breath, taking a moment to just pause and noticing what is it that's so intolerable that I feel like I need to disconnect right now,
Yes.
which is a courageous question, but so valuable, so useful. And I think with like the relationship with our body and with food, it's not just like, I think, yeah, a common piece is numbing or self-soothing and overeating, but I think it also comes in the gamut of restricting, of being overly obsessive of calories, of not necessarily, eating or nourishing your body enough, right? It's like the both ends of the spectrum.
But by the
And
way, they're doing the same thing.
yes,
They're you're you're just doing it in different ways, but they're both forms of disconnection.
yes, totally.
Mhm.
And I think too, that's why so often, maybe people are like, well, when I lose the 5 pounds or the 10 pounds or whatever, then I can be happy, or then I can go after this thing that I want. I feel like it's a good example of one of these stories that's likely coming from shadow, because most often, whatever that insecurity, that story that was circling, if they lose the weight, if they, get that quote unquote ideal body that they've been wanting, it's not only still lurking, it's often louder. Like I can think of countless people I've talked to who have gotten, that the ideal quote unquote body, and like their insecurities were almost louder than ever before. And it's because I think you're turning away, right? Distracting, like, let's just fix external, let's just fix external. And if you're not looking at internally of what's really present, of what's really desiring and asking for your attention, it's
Mhm.
it's not going to go away. It's always lurking. It's just going to come out in louder ways.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is really important to mention here is that we have a tendency also to mood alter. So, for instance, what happens for some people is, let's say they lose the 10 pounds, they release the 10 pounds, it might show up in a different trap. Like it might come up in a different way. Like maybe it's through shopping, maybe it's through busyness, maybe it's through, spending a lot of money, whatever
Mhm.
the case. Maybe it's, signing up for a lot of courses, right? Because that's, for some people, we have to look at, it all comes down to intention. It all
Yes.
comes down to intention. Am I doing this intentionally, and is this aligned with me, both internally and externally, as
Mm.
opposed to, am I doing this from a place of shadow, meaning I'm doing this because I have a sense of lack or scarcity or,
Mhm.
something like that, because there's so many different reasons why we do things. There's so many different reasons. And so I think it's an important inquiry. And I did want to just mention one
Yeah.
thing that you mentioned before. Shadow work is actually one of the most courageous pieces of work people can do.
Mm.
And I say, Carl Jung has a great quote, and he says, shadow work is the path of the heart warrior.
Mm.
And the reason being is because we have to be willing. We have to be willing to turn inward to face everything we've spent a lifetime running from in order to really integrate the shadow. And if we're not willing to do that, then what happens is our life becomes a series of um, wake up calls in order for us to turn inward. And sometimes that happens by force. It might
Yeah.
be through loss. It might be through trauma. It might be through some type of intense, painful experience. But the way that we are designed is that we will always be shuttled to turn inward so that we can actually do this work. And most people will spend this entire lifetime never doing it and then come back sometime again and they'll be faced with that again. But I say to people all the time, it's like, there is so much freedom when you no longer have to run.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stop
Totally.
running.
And just so much, even as I said, I'm just like felt like there's so much more energy because
Yeah.
it is, yes, it's unconscious, but it's unconscious, I feel like is our main driver. It is what's leading. It's what's leading a lot of things if you're not aware. And it's if that's like what's constantly operating is running from this discomfort, running from these golden shadows of yourself that you feel too scary to really own, that's actually consistently taking energy from you. It's, I think I feel if it is like maybe more of life force versus
Mhm.
energy.
Yeah.
I think the more too we can integrate this, right? The more life force that you spoke to, like aliveness when you were speaking to embodiment. Um, yeah,
And the less we go into intense periods of fear, the less we go into intense periods of shame and
yeah,
all of that, we actually see emotions more fluid, which
yeah.
is what emotions should be. They should be
Mhm.
fluid. It's energy, emotion. It should move. But what happens with really dense energy is it gets trapped in the body. And then that's what turns into anxiety. That's what turns into depression. That's what turns into all of those things because it's so dense that it cannot move through your system. It can
Mm.
create illness. And so, what I say to people all the time is that emotions actually don't need to be scary. They're just meant to actually move through our systems. And yes, at times they can feel very intense, but here's the key: emotion without the story is very different
Mm.
than emotion with the story. Let's say my story is I'm never going to meet someone who who I can love and who can really love me. I'll never have that kind of relationship or partnership. Let's say
Mm.
that's the story. Well, that story is going to generate sadness. It's going to
Mm.
generate shame. It's going to generate fear. Instead of just experiencing moments where I might feel a tinge of sadness or I might feel a tinge of loneliness or a tinge of disconnection, that story will fuel those emotions to the point where they become prevalent and we're
Yeah,
always feeling lonely. We're always feeling disconnected.
yeah,
We're always feeling less than. And that's the difference.
totally.
It's supposed to just meant to move.
Yeah, I appreciate how you just distilled that out because it's so helpful. And
Sorry.
um,
Moving.
yeah,
Don't
I'm
let my
trying.
dog
I
in.
Um, actually a client of mine just shared this with me last night, but I won't go into all of the brief bit of it and how it relates to this in shadow and emotion and being able to be with emotion. Is she had a romantic relationship that ended and she was left really, heartbroken and sad, and um has been in for the last few months this story of what that means about her, right? How nobody's ever been there for her, nobody's ever really able to love her and show up as she is for them, and she's really been in the story of feeling wrong and bad. It's something about her. And this past weekend, through a lot of the tools and things we've been working with, she shared she's finally let and had the capacity to allow herself just to be sad. And it was okay that she was sad, right? It didn't mean anything about her. It wasn't wrong. She was just sad, right? She's a human who is sad. And she shared it was like, had 2 days of feeling sad and being okay with that. And she said Monday she had this new sense of just like freedom, free, like realize like her value, like any of those stories that kept lurking before, they just like weren't there. It wasn't about that nobody's ever going to love her, but she just felt so free from that grip of that heartbreak. And I just thought it was such, I mean, one, as her coach and support, I was just like so touched to hear that. And I just think from what you just shared, I just wanted to share that example. It speaks to not that it's easy work, right? But it can be easeful. There can be some more ease in it. It's never easy. And it's the conscious choice to allow ourselves to feel and be with the emotion to the best of our ability. The more we have the capacity to stay in our body as we do that, which is our anchor to the present moment, the more we have the ability to process and move through that emotion, which is emotion, as you said, Suzanne. So it doesn't get stuck and lodged. So we don't just get in that mental loop. That is not a healthful place to be.
Yeah, because what we don't realize, and I'm not going to really get into a lot of this because it's a whole nother conversation, but what we don't realize is that as the story empowers the emotion. So what ends up happening is if I feel like, in the case of your client, if I feel like something's wrong with me, nobody's ever going to love me.
Yeah.
But here's what we don't really understand is that we become addicted to stories and pain. When we're addicted to our pain and our stories, it in the same way that cocaine and heroin does. So what ends up happening is it becomes so much a part of our identity. And I know you've witnessed this. When you see somebody who defends their limitations and defends their experience, that's a sign of addiction. So for example, I hear people say all the time, well, you don't understand. You don't get it. You haven't lived what I've lived. You understand how hard it is. You've never been there. That is somebody who is addicted because they're trying to say it's almost like going into a place of reinforcing that experience. And so no matter what you say, no matter what you do, no matter how you hold space, they can't take it in because they're too addicted to the pain and the experience. So in those kinds of situations, it means that you have to slowly bring it to their awareness because most people aren't even aware of it. But B, look at what is the secondary gain that they get out of defending that story. Because here's the thing, if they don't defend the story, then this is where the golden shadow comes in. They might actually have to open themselves up to love again. They might actually have to be vulnerable. They might actually have to believe in their value and worth. They might actually have to be responsible for their actions. So sometimes it's easier to defend and remain addicted to the story and pain than to actually step in to responsibility and worth and truth and alignment and action and all of that stuff, which for a lot of people is a lot harder than just staying stuck.
So much that I could say on that.
It's a lot. It's a
But
lot.
I think just to like I guess my summarizing comment would be, yeah, like when our identity is so wrapped up in
Mhm.
that limiting story, in that pain, in that whatever it may be. And there is usually what I like, you said, what is that secondary benefit we're getting from that? But when it's so wrapped up in that one, you can't really usually see that. It just is feels like your truth, but it's not capital T truth, right? It's like more of a little, it's not really true. And yeah, it's courageous to make the other choice to really start to shift that. Um,
Yeah, and we do have to understand that there is a physiological component to it that where it does feel there's a great book out by a woman named Carolyn Elliott called Existential Kink.
I just read
And
that.
yeah, and it's a shadow book that talks
Mm-hmm.
about addiction to shadow parts,
Mm-hmm.
where we get addicted and we actually get off on um, these shadow parts. And so, what ends up happening, and again, a lot of times this isn't happening consciously,
Yeah.
but there's an adrenaline rush that happens when we reinforce the pain, when we reinforce the story. There is, in fact, there we get almost like a warped sense of aliveness from that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's deep and it's complex, but I will tell you that when we actually finally really get this and we actually see what's happening, we get to see, oh my God, I have so much more power over my life than I actually thought that I did. Because sometimes we feel so powerless, we feel so powerless,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
I definitely like I write about this in my book. I used to feel so powerless around my relationship with my body and food. That's how I felt.
Mhm.
On a funnier, lighter note, I have to share like I think it's an existential kink of mine. It's kind of silly, but it's really true. And anyone who knows me, sometimes this might be surprising because I think I come across as so peaceful and calm. And I am a very aggressive driver. And I get off on how bad every other driver is. Like, I've like, it's been something I've been trying to work with the last few years. And after, yeah, recently reading her book, I've just been noticing and like how just it's fine tuned my awareness to how much I get off on how bad everyone else is driving and how they don't know how to drive. And it's just been so interesting to just watch that in this little game as I'm driving my
And there
car.
may be a piece of what I call leaky anger in that.
Yeah,
So,
that could be true. Yeah.
there could be a little piece of leaky anger. And what I mean by leaky anger, it's like sort of misdirected anger that kind
Yeah.
of comes out. And it's sort of like, yo, you idiot, how do you drive like that? Blah, blah, blah. It's just kind of this, so
Yeah. And sometimes I can for myself track or gauge where I'm at, maybe with my anger, with just
Mhm.
in general, in regards to what language comes out of my mouth in the car. Sometimes it's like, come on, baby, come on, honey, and it's loving. And other times it's like, and I'm like, okay, girl, you gotta go do some work.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah. Suzanne, thank you just for everything you've shared. And I'll ask for a little bit of how you can find out more from Suzanne. You're just like such a wealth of wisdom and knowledge, and just like you have one of the deepest, truest, genuine hearts I know. So I'm just so grateful just to get to ask you questions and have you on here. I like to wrap up these conversations with asking your number one main takeaway that everyone should know or should do or practice if they want to live a more radically embodied life.
Work with your shadow.
Okay.
No, I'm serious.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I feel like that's if you
Yeah.
truly want to become embodied and you truly want to land, in my work, I say if you really want to take the journey home,
Mm.
you need to go into everything that got you away from that place in the first place. Um, so yeah, I believe that whether you do your shadow work with a therapist, whether you do it with a coach like you, whether you do it in, groups, whether you come on a journey with me, however you do it, I just feel that the number one thing I think we have to do, and there's many pathways to the shadow.
Mhm.
Um, I just feel like getting into the unconscious is a really important piece of the healing journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so good. I totally agree with that. It's a great takeaway for everyone.
Mhm.
How can people find out more about your work and your offerings? You mentioned, yeah, that you have some shadow work stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, I have two websites. I have SuzanneHanna.com and I have thewildernesswalk.com. And the wilderness meaning I help people navigate their internal wilderness, which is my form of the shadow. And, I do that in many ways. I do that in taking people on life changing journeys. I have a journey that goes into the golden shadow. I have a journey that goes into the dark shadow. I also have started a shadow coach certification program where I actually teach people how to utilize this work. So there's all kinds of ways to do that. And I actually am now switching. I have a free Facebook group called The Map, which is actually going to be shifting in on November 1st into a primarily shadow group
Oh,
where I'm going to be
wow.
focusing solely on the shadow. So there's ways to do that. And, I have some courses, I have programs, so people can look up all that stuff on my websites.
Amazing. Amazing. Yeah. So the free group and everything will be linked to make it easy to find Suzanne's work. But I definitely, anyone who's listening who's curious, after this conversation about shadow and shadow work, definitely check out Suzanne's work and her offerings. And because yeah, you have a plethora of not only offerings but information and support.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. Um, thank you everyone for listening. And I hope you go check out Suzanne's work and really take up that idea of, yeah, doing your shadow work. If you're not already actively doing that, it will transform your life, like for the betterment, not only for you, but for everyone that you come in contact with.
And I do want to say one thing, and this is why I adore you so much, Emily, is because I think because the shadow lives in the body,
Mhm.
that doing some form of body work is really crucial as well.
Mhm.
Because, again, we talked about that dense energy and being able to move that energy and being able to align your body, I think is a big piece of this work too. In fact, almost everybody I work with, I say, get into doing some type of body work. It's really important.
Mm, it is. It is. Is it, as you said, like it lives in the cells, right? It's in the body. And we need to do the like energetic, kind of embodiment work and the physical, all of it. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Awesome. All
Yay.
right. Thanks everyone for listening. Go check out Suzanne's work. Take care.
Bye.